All right, so we last week started talking about the atheistic naturalist worldview. And we talked about prime reality. They believe that matter is all there is, that matter is eternal and prime. There is no God. There is no supernatural. Everything is just physical. Then we talked about external reality. So building off that, the cosmos, the universe exists as a uniformity of cause and effect in a closed system. Closed system means there's no God, there's no outside influence, no outside intervention. There is no outside. There's nothing outside the universe. And everything in the universe is a part of this uniform system of cause and effect. And then we looked at their view of humanity, that we as humans are just basically complex machines as a part of this closed system. We are part of this whole uniformity of cause and effect. And so the idea that you have a personality, that there's some you, a spirit you within your body is just this interaction of chemical and physical properties. That's all it is. There's no eternal being, there's no essence of you outside of just these chemical, electrical reactions in the brain. And so that means that death is an extinction of everything you are, everything you know, everything you experience, all of your hopes and dreams and loves, all of that will cease to exist the minute your heart stops beating. And then we last looked at their view of knowledge, that through our innate and autonomous human reason and the methods of science, we can know the universe. And the universe is as it is. It is in its normal state. It's not in a fallen state. There is no, making all things new at the end of time. The world is as it is. And that's where we left off. So we're going to pick this up in looking at the naturalist view of morality. They say that morality is related only to human beings and is constructed by human beings. There is no natural law inscribed in the universe. So there is no absolute moral truth. There is no absolute standard. Now, historically, most people who have held naturalist worldview do claim basic moral principles. And the principles and even the ethics of a lot of naturalists seem very Christian. They would agree, you shouldn't kill, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't, that there are some things you shouldn't do. There are some things you should do. You should care for the poor, you should look out for the defenseless, you should care for the widows and the orphans. They would say, yes, that is good things to do. Respect the dignity of people, affirm love, tell the truth, be honest and fair, be generous and sacrificial and working for the common good. An atheistic naturalist would agree with all of that, but for the most part. And many of them even look at Jesus and think that he was a very moral, ethical teacher. And many of them would say that they agree with the ethical teachings of Jesus. What is different is the basis for those morals. What is the foundation of these ethical norms? So to the atheistic naturalist, it's not God. It's us. It's human society. We are the basis. There's nothing transcendent about morality. There is nothing endowed by our Creator. So a true atheistic naturalist would have a problem with that line in the Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. They would say there is no Creator to endow anything. Those rights are merely agreed upon by the society, by the government. The government gives you those rights and freedoms. One guy, Lametri, said, you see that natural law is nothing but an intimate feeling which belongs to the imagination like all other feelings, thought included. So our beliefs, our thoughts, our morals are all just like feelings. It's just something in our imagination. It's just things that we've dreamed up. And this would mean that all ethics are situational ethics. All ethics are situational. None of them are theologically based. They are all derived from human experience only. So one of the major questions that atheistic naturalists must answer is, how does ought derive from is? How does ought derive from is? What do I mean by that? Well, as Christians, we affirm this transcendent origin of ethics, right? That they originate in this infinitely personal God who is outside the system, and he is the measure of what is good and true and right and just. Well, atheistic naturalists have no such source, right? It's a closed system. There is no transcendent being. There is no transcendent good or right. To them, ethics is merely the creation of the human mind. So how does one get from the fact of self-consciousness and self-determination, the realm of is and can, right? That's what the realm of is and can is just this self-consciousness, self-determination. How do you get from that to the realm of what ought to be? What ought to be done or ought not to be done? What is the measurement or the standard of oughtness? Well, the best they have to say is all people share a sense of moral value. I see, it's innate. It's part of our species. We all just share this sense of moral values. In fact, this one, G.G. Simpson said, the feeling of rightness without objective inquiry into the reasons for this feeling and without possible test as to the truth or faultness of the premises involved. So to a naturalist, an idea that some things are right and that some things are wrong, it's just a feeling. There is no objective reason for it. There is no test to determine whether it is true or not. And Simpson further argues for an ethic based on objective inquiry found in what he calls the harmonious adjustment of people to each other and their environment. In other words, whatever promotes harmony is good. So whatever promotes harmony between me and you, between us and Methodist Church, between Republicans and Democrats, between Bulldog fans and Tennessee fans, whatever promotes harmony is good. Whatever promotes harmony between us and the environment is good. And what does not promote harmony is bad. So an action is good if it is approved by the group as harmonious, and that means that it promotes the survival of the group. This goes back to Darwin's survival of the fittest, the idea of evolution. What they would say is that we have evolved these morals and ethical feelings because it helps the survival of our group, of our tribe. And that's the reason why these exist. It's because the ultimate good is the continuance of human life. They would say that human survival is the primary virtue. So whatever we have to do to help us as people, individuals, and help us as a group, whatever helps us survive is good and harmonious. That is their basis for morals and for ethics. Any thoughts or questions about morality? The naturalist view of morality.
The people that believe they have no absolute, are they absolutely correct?
Because that itself is an absolute claim. To say there is no absolutes is an absolute. So yeah. And we'll look at some more of those here in a little while, these self-contradicting arguments. We'll come back to this idea of ought and is later on. All right, history. What does naturalism say about history? It says that history is a linear stream of events linked by cause and effect, but without an overarching purpose. Now, we would agree as Christians that history is a linear stream of events. We agree that there is cause and effect, but we believe there's no overarching purpose. We believe history is going somewhere. To the naturalist, there is no differentiation between human history and natural history because we are just products of nature. So human history really is just a product of nature's history. I can't even begin to pronounce this man's name, but he said, the origin of what is, there's that idea of just the things that are, what is, the origin of what is, man, the earth, the universe, is shrouded in a mystery we are no closer to solving than was the chronicler of Genesis. So you see what he's done there in that statement. He both discounts the truth of Genesis and says that we also have no idea. So he's saying that Moses, he doesn't even name Moses, just the chronicler, whoever this man, whoever it was that wrote Genesis 1:1, didn't know what he was talking about, and we're no closer to knowing where we came from either. At least there's a little bit of humility, I guess, in the statement. But if you take this at face value, what he says, what they say about history, human history has no value. There's no value to human history because we're just a happy accident. We're just a roll of the dice of evolutionary history. We're just here by chance. Evolution attempts to explain the how of human development, but it can't explain the why. Why are we here? Why do we exist? They would say, for no reason. They would say that evolution in history had no goal. There was no intelligence behind it. There was nothing directing it. It had no goal. And so history then is what we make it to be. Human events only have the meaning we assign them. And so when humanity is gone, when the sun swells up and burns the earth to a cinder, so is our history. And humanity is wiped out of existence and out of the universe's memory as if we never happened. That's what the atheistic naturalist believes about history. Now, we see in this, and when we look at postmodernism, we'll look into this more, but if human history only, and in the events of human history, only have the meanings we assign them, if there is no absolute standard by which we judge the events of history, then what does that mean for, say, something like the Holocaust? It has meaning, and it has a particular meaning because we assign it that. But is there an absolute that says that it was wrong? Not to an atheist. That's only wrong because human society has deemed it wrong. Which means human society could someday deem it right, correct? That's one of the dangers of this line of thinking. And that brings us to the core commitments. Really, that speaks to the core commitments. Naturalism itself implies there are no core commitments. At least not in any kind of a group scale, right? There's no any given atheistic naturalist is put upon by some kind of a commitment. Core commitments are just adopted either unwittingly. People just adopt core commitments without even really thinking about it, which is sometimes true. It's what mom and dad believe. It's what my friends, do. It's what society tells me to value. So there are a lot of unwitting core commitments that people do adopt. But they would say that it's either unwittingly or it's just chosen by you. But there's nothing in naturalism that necessitates any particular core commitments because there's no meaning behind human existence. There's no God. There's no body out there to commit to. It's just left up to each of us how we determine to live our lives. So I want us to look at any questions about that? About history, about core commitments. Well, I want us to look at two notable forms of naturalism. And the first, you've heard this term before, secular humanism. Now, we have to differentiate here between the historic perspective that sometimes is called Christian humanism or just humanism. John Calvin could be described as that. Erasmus, Milton, they basically were humanists, called humanists because they held humanity in such high esteem because they were created in God's image. It was an emphasis on the dignity, on the endowed freedoms, the inherent nature of God's image within us, even though we're fallen. And John Calvin especially talked about that, about the fact that we are just hopelessly fallen and depraved, but there was a sense of putting a focus on humanity. Evangelism has a very humanist focus because we are interested in seen people say. It's nothing like what we talked about. We talked about secular humanism. Because secular humanism, first of all, denies the existence of God. It's an atheistic worldview. And it sees humanity as the ultimate authority. We are the determination of what is good and right. So secular humanism really takes what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden and says that was the right thing to do. That was the good thing to do because we are the determiners of what is good and evil, right and wrong. They would applaud that because there is no God. So who else determines that but us? So secular humanism isn't because they are, championing humanity and want to serve humanity. That's not what that humanism is about. It's about that humans are the ultimate authority. Humans are what it's all about. Now, not all naturalists are humanists, but every secular humanist is an atheistic naturalist. Okay, so it's important to think about that. The second form is Marxism. Now, this is something that, I learned about in history class and didn't think much more about until recently. And we've been seeing a rise of Marxism throughout the Western world, Europe and in the United States. This is probably one of the most historically significant outgrowths of naturalism. Marxism developed with the goal of helping people and enabling them to gain economic control over their own lives. That was sort of the premise. Was that we got to help the working man. We got to help him gain some economic control over his own life. Marxism claims to be a form of scientific socialism. That's what it claims to be. Now, kind of like I said earlier about humanists and naturalists, not all humanists are Marxists, but all Marxists are secular humanists. You can't be a Marxist and not be a humanist. Now, Karl Marx was influenced largely by two naturalist thinkers, Greg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Ludwig Feuerbach. Now, Hegel was an idealist. Okay? He believed that God or an absolute spirit is a reality progressively realizing itself in the world. It's not a being, it's not a force distinct from the world. So, he had this sort of idea of this, like a life force kind of spirit type thing, not in a spiritual sense, but just in almost like a cosmic, shared consciousness kind of an idea. And he saw this process at work in the world as dialectical in nature. Now, I know it's getting a little technical with philosophy and stuff like this, but being dialectic means that it comes through conflict. And the idea is that you would have a conflict, and that conflict would then establish, would bring out a certain spirit, certain way of thinking and a way of being that would, almost like a new norm, that would then call forth its own antagonist. So in other words, history keeps recreating these conflicts. You have a conflict, it resolves into a certain spirit. Maybe that spirit, let's say, is democratic freedom from the West. So we could look at like the American Revolution. It's a conflict. What was brought out that conflict? A monarch, right? Monarchy brought about, and colonization brought about a conflict, which brought about this new spirit of democratic freedom. But that by necessity everything has to have an antagonist. So freedom creates its own antagonist, right? That it then wars with. And to a Marxist, they would say that antagonist is capitalism. That capitalism then becomes the new bad guy that wars with, and you have this conflict that will create some other new reality that will itself generate another conflict. That's a dialectical view of history. So each conflict creates this higher, more complex state of being, and it's a never-ending process. Now, that's a very speculative, kind of highfalutin view of history, I know. And a Marxist, especially Hegel, would see human society as the highest vehicle of the expression of this spirit. So again, the human society is what, without meaning to, it's what all of natural history has led to, is to humanity. We are the certainly the pinnacle of the universe, not of creation, because he wouldn't say that we were created, but the pinnacle of evolution and all of the processes that made the universe would be us. So Hegel was very idealistic. And he had this very idealistic view of history. He kind of believed that history was going somewhere just through this chance nature of these conflicting episodes, one after the other, right? So Feuerbach was not an idealist, he was a materialist. He didn't at all think like Hegel. He believed that human beings, he literally said, human beings are what they eat. So you really are what you eat. That originated from him. And he said that religion was a purely human invention. Now, you know, Karl Marx has been famous for saying that religion is the opiate of the masses, right? That came from Feuerbach. He believed that we created religion. And what he said was religious belief and a belief in God is a projection of human potentiality. And when we talk about God, when we have this belief of God, he says what that really is like a subconscious projection of who we know we really should be, of where we're going. So basically, we are God and we're going to become God. It's kind of the idea there, that God is just this expression of all of our unrealized potential and hopes and dreams. Well, if you know anything about Marxism, you see both of those. This view of history, of conflict, of conflict that begets a new reality, this idea that there is no God and religion is an opiate of the masses. And Marx accepted that critique of religion wholeheartedly. And most Marxists thought is very atheistic in nature. But like I said, he accepted Hegel's view of history. And the goal of history is a perfect ideal human society, or a utopia. Utopia is the perfect goal of history. Now, Marx was a materialist. He saw history in this series of dialectical struggles, primarily through economic factors, right? He was mainly concerned with economics. And since we are, and if you follow the logic, at least he's being logically consistent here, if we are just material beings, if we are what we eat, and that's all we are, then wouldn't our primary concern be gaining material possessions and getting food? Basically, what Marx believed was that our lives are understood solely in the terms of working in order to satisfy our needs. So we're machines that need fuel, was his perspective. We're like a car, and we're just working for the next gas pump, just to get our tank filled up. And that's all we are. That's all humanity is. Now, there are four fatal flaws. Said that 4 times real fast. 4 fatal flaws of Marxist thought. The first is because Marx rejected any belief in God, any belief in a transcendent purpose to history. His faith that human history was moving toward this ideal society. What's the basis of that? Why would human history be moving toward an ideal society? If there's no God, if there's no point to history, if there's no purpose behind any of this, why would he assume that? I mean, if you look back at human history, there's nothing in human history to make us assume that we all only make good decisions that progress things in a positive direction, right? Look at World War II as a great example of that. The World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars, right? Now World War II came. Proof positive that, yeah, humanity's not always moving in the right direction. So that's a fatal flaw. The second is that Marx believed it was inevitable that humans would be motivated to work toward this ideal society idea. But why should I work for a better society? Why should I work to end exploitation of other people? And there are no moral values for me to base that desire on, if there's no transcendent truth by which I can critically evaluate a culture as needing to be rewritten or overcome or replaced, then who is to say what makes a just, fair, ideal society? What is the basis of saying whether our society right now is fair, just, and ideal? There is none. A third fatal flaw is this simplistic view of human nature that we are self-creating through our work. Marx believed that work and economics, again, were the primary motivating factors that shape human society and that give people meaning and purpose in their lives. Then why is it when you send checks out to people who aren't working, they're not motivated to work, right? And we've seen that today in our country right now. There is nothing inherent in people that motivate them to work necessarily. So that idea that we are somehow going to be self-motivated to work no matter what, I mean, history just shows that's not true. And then number four, Marx had a simplistic view of the human problem, right? And he believed that greed and envy and murder and hate and competition, he said all of that arose out of this idea of social division, between the working class and the management class, that it was all about poverty and wealth. It was the wealth gap. That's what it was all about. In an ideal society, then, if you can eliminate that, if you can make everything socialist, and if we all just had everything in common, and if we all just, could just get along and have what we wanted, then everything would be ideal. That would solve human problems. The source of human problems is that some people make more money than other people. If we could just equalize all of that, then we would all just love each other and just be kind and compassionate to each other and generous and selfless. That's what he believed. Well, that's obviously, observably not true. Is it really plausible to think that selfishness and greed are solely the cause of scarcity? No. Is it really possible to make people good if we just give them the right environment? No. But you see this line of thinking all the time in politics today, right? The problem isn't that there are violent, hateful people out there. The problem is guns. If we just remove guns from the environment, people won't kill each other. That's number four. That's a Marxist view. The idea that if we could just eliminate police departments and just put socialists on the street, that would solve everything. No, it doesn't. So there are lots of solutions proposed today that are basically, if we could just change the environment, it would change the people. Yes?
There was an article today of a young teacher out in California, I think it was named Fresno, that said that part of the reason of problems today is the racism of expecting students to pay attention in class, to follow instructions, and do the right thing was absolutely ridiculous, and it was like white supremacy.
Right.
That they shouldn't have to follow rules.
Again, it's the idea that the problem isn't something inherent in us. The problem is out here. And if we could just set up the right kind of classroom, we just put the right kind of teacher in there and teach the right kind of curriculum, it would solve all the problems without addressing anything about the natural evil in human beings. That's exactly that line of thinking. And the theme of it changes, whether it's economics or whether it's racism or whether, whatever it is, that the theme will change, but the philosophy behind the proffered solution is the same. It's a very, very good point. Anything else about naturalism? We are going to cover all of nihilism here in a few minutes, and we're going to catch up and get on the schedule. I told you last week we do that. We were about to do that. Any other questions about naturalism?
So Marx didn't follow his own teaching.
No, none of these people do, because these are unsustainable worldviews. They are not consistent, they're not coherent, they are not sustainable. So you're making a very good point, it's exactly right, which is one of the reasons why it is vital that we as Christians live out our faith, practice what we preach, because when we don't, people look at us and think that our worldview is also inconsistent and incoherent. But it isn't. The problem is not with our worldview, the problem is with us. So we've got to strive to do that.
While you're swapping that.
Yes.
You've got, one of the same people that influenced Marx, influenced our founding fathers. His name is Thomas. And his basic idea is that you can trace all human behavior to the desire for self-preservation. That at our core, all of us should be motivated by a desire to do whatever we have to do to live. Which sounds great on paper. And if that were true, then Marx would have, his ideas would have been a whole lot more successful, because he would say, hey, we all want to get along because we all want to survive. The problem is that's just not true. There are a lot of people out there who don't care if they live or die, as long as they prove their point. Take out somebody they hate, you get famous, or the best version of it is do someone else before they do you.
Yeah.
If Hobbes was right, then Marx wouldn't have made quite so big a mess of things. But when you build on that broad of a foundation, you're doing it.
Yeah.
The founding fathers at least realized that we still have to build in protection for society. That we're going to build freedoms on the idea that people more or less going to act with one another's best interests in part. But just to be safe, we're going to create a police force, we're going to create a jail system, and we're going to create 3 branches of government.
Right. I was about to say, we're going to put these protections within our branches of government to hold each other accountable and in check. Yeah. Those checks and balances. Or because they understood that human nature is not that simplistic.
It'd be great if it were.
And power corrupts, as it did in England. Power corrupts. All right, thank you. Great insight there, man.
And I heard on TV today that this man over in South Carolina take his own, take his own death at a big insurance. $10 million. But, people not always good.
That's right. People aren't really not ever good. You want to get right down to it. At least not any kind of ultimate sense. Okay. So the nihilistic worldview, which, my subtitle is it's all pointless, because that is the nihilistic worldview. It's all pointless. James Sire notes here in the book that nihilism, he says nihilism is more of a feeling than a philosophy, that it's more of this solitary stance than a worldview. So really, in a way, nihilism is a denial of any kind of philosophy. It's a denial of worldview. You can even think of nihilism as the anti-worldview, because it denies that you can know anything. It denies that there's any value in anything. It is literally the negation of reality itself. None of this is real. You don't exist, I don't exist. That's in essence what nihilism says. Now, there are some modern cultural examples of nihilism that you might be familiar with. You ever seen this painting? Salvador Dali was a surrealist, which was a branch of nihilism, right? And so a lot of modern art, like Salvador Dali, is expressing a nihilistic tendency at the very least, if not an outright nihilistic worldview. Jackson Pollock, have you ever heard of him? I mean, does that look like art to you? I think when Abby was 2, she did something very similar to that. But nihilism says that there is no meaning. So nihilistic art is meaningless. It's people just literally throwing globs of paint onto a canvas. Andy Warhol is another example of that. Now just look at this. So look at the name of this piece of art. I mean, even the name of it is nihilistic, right? I mean, at least Salvador Dali gives his some meaning with a name, the persistence of memory. But Jackson Pollock just calls it number 1A, 1948. He doesn't even want to sign this meaning in the name of it. Andy Warhol just took cans of soup and painted them in different colors and called it Campbell soup cans. And called that art.
So,
and sold it for a lot of money, right? And this is one from 1917. It's called Fountain. It's literally a urinal. But that's called art. That's nihilism. It's absurd. It becomes a farce. It becomes a satire. That's a satirical piece of art. It has no meaning. Or plays by Samuel Beckett, like Endgame, or Waiting for Godot, or Breath. Now, this one on the bottom, Breath, is literally, there are no actors. There's a pile of trash on the stage. The lights come up, and they kind of dim and come up a few times and dim again. And at the beginning of this 30 seconds, the 30-second play, at the beginning of the play, there's a recorded scream. You hear somebody breathe in, breathe out, and then the same recorded scream. That's it. That's the play. And that's considered a play. That's considered art. But it is meant to convey the idea that there is no meaning, that there is nothing to life. It's a breath, and you come in screaming, you breathe, you go out screaming. That's it. Life is just a pile of trash. Waiting for Godot. Here's one of the quotes. You can just hear the nihilism in this. Have you not done tormenting me with your accursed time? It's abominable. When? One day, is that not enough for you? One day he went dumb. One day I went blind. One day we'll go deaf. One day we were born. One day we shall die. The same day, the same second. Is that not enough for you? They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant, and then it's night once more. Kind of sounds like Job or Ecclesiastes a little bit there, doesn't it, man? So he's saying, life, you're born, and you might as well be born over a grave, because you're born and then you're dead. And it's like that. And it's just pointless. It's meaningless. Vanity, all is vanity. Books like Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a series of novels, and in this series, we just have a couple of guys that are time-traveling hitchhikers, right? And they're going all across the universe, and they go back and forth in time from the Big Bang to the end of the universe. And at one point, they come across this super intelligent pan-dimensional race. And if I remember right, I think they're like mice or something absurd like that. And they want to know the answer to life, the universe, and everything. They want to know what the answer is to all of this. They make this city-sized computer that spends 7.5 million years running calculations to come up with the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And the answer is 42. That's the answer. 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Well, then they decide they don't know what the question is. If 42 is the answer, what's the question? So they make an even bigger computer to calculate the question of life, the universe, and everything that 42 is the answer of. And this computer was much bigger than a city. It was the size of a planet. And they named it Earth. And it had a bunch of these little ape-like beings running around all over thinking they meant something, but they were just a part of a computer program. And so again, right as the Earth is about to spit out the ultimate question, this other race of aliens come and demolish the Earth to make way for basically an interstellar interstate. Oh, well, so much for that question. But then later on, and towards the end of the series, maybe the second book, I think, they do discover the question. So what is the ultimate question to life, the universe, and everything? What is 6 times 9? And the answer is 42. 6 times 9 is not 42. The point, and that's the point. The point is absurdity. The point is that you can either know the answer, but not the question. You can know the question, but not the answer. But you can never know both. You can never know the question and the answer. That's the point that he's making. And that's nihilism. It's meaningless. Now, how do we get from naturalism to nihilism? And James Sire says that nihilism is the natural child of naturalism. Why is that? Well, think about it. The results of human reason have proved to be less than reliable. I can mention World War II is a great example. We were supposed to be reaching the pinnacle of human existence when that happened. The Holocaust happened. Living in a closed universe in which we have no hope of changing anything, that's awfully confining. Death as extinction, that's psychologically disturbing. You really want to think about that. Being the highest form of life means very little if we are no more valuable than a piece of gravel in your driveway. You think about at least that piece of gravel is millions of years old, right? According to them. So a piece of rock lives longer than you do. So where's the comfort in being the highest form of life? So all of the assumptions of naturalism lead to nihilism. That life is meaningless. Now there are three bridges that Sire points to here in the book that led from naturalism to nihilism. And the first is the bridge of necessity and chance. So the direct and logical implications, as I said, of the primary propositions of naturalism leads to nihilism. The idea we're part of a system from which we cannot escape and we have no hope of changing ultimately leads to the loss of human dignity, free will, even freedom. We live under the illusion of those things. There's an illusion of dignity and free will and freedom. But we are just being deluded by this system of which we're part. There is no dignity. There is no free will. There is no freedom. That means that we're not ultimately responsible for our own decisions and actions then, right? That's logical. If I have no free will, then I can't really be held responsible for my actions. I'm just part of the machinery of the universe. I'm just a cog in the machine. Everything that happens is really the will of the cosmos. It's not mine. Now, B.F. Skinner wasn't a nihilist, but he expressed a nihilist idea when he argued that a person does not act on the world acts on him. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about the environment. The problem isn't innate in me, it's in the environment. There's nothing wrong with me. There must be something wrong with the universe. The universe, the world is the problem, not me. Now, Skinner was a lead thinker in psychological behavioralism. Right? That's what he focused on is behavior, human behavior. And he believed that the only way to change a person, as we said earlier about naturalism, the only way to change a person is to change the environment. Because we are just reactors. All people do is react to our environment. There is no freedom for self-determination. We just react. So following that, nihilism says that human beings are conscious machines without the ability to affect their own destiny or do anything significant. Therefore, human beings as valuable beings are dead. In other words, there is no value in humanity. We have no value. We didn't come about as a necessity of the universe. We came about as chance. They're just chance. Chance occurrences led to necessary processes that created other chance occurrences that led to us. We are here by chance happenings. That's the process of creation. Big Bang and evolution, all just a roll of the dice. And so nihilists take that process to its logical conclusion, which is absurdity. As we've seen reflected in all of that artwork and in those plays and books, it's absurd. Because that's what chance is about. It's absurdity. Our existence is causeless, it's purposeless, it's directionless. There's nothing rational or reasonable about chance, right? You can't predict the roll of the dice. And that's what our existence is like. Naturalism does not provide a basis for human significance. It denies the possibility of self-determination. Therefore, everything is absurd and meaningless. The second bridge he calls the bridge of the great cloud of unknowing. And he's kind of borrowed that term from a 14th century Christian mysticist called the cloud of unknowing. And you'll catch on why he calls it this, the great cloud of unknowing. Because based on naturalist propositions, we have no way of knowing. There's no way for us to know what is real, what is true, what is right, that's all an illusion. So why would we assume that meaningless matter has any interest or ability in leading us as conscious beings to truly perceive the universe as it is? Why would we assume that if our brains and our existence, if our brains and our thoughts are just chemical processes of this brain that itself was just formed by accident, why would we assume that that brain can make any logical or correct assumptions or conclusions about anything? Why would we think that? We're the only things in the universe that even cares about this kind of stuff, right? The ocean doesn't care about existence and the nature of time and morality, right? The bears and the birds and the bees don't care about that stuff. Only we do. And if our consciousness arose from this complex interrelation of highly ordered matter, then why should what that matter perceives or believes to be true, right, or real, why would we assume that it's true, right, or real?
There's a fun example of that. You're walking through a forest and you see a bunch of mushrooms that have grown in a shape that spells "Welcome to North Dakota." If they just grew randomly, do they actually mean anything? Of course not. It's just a coincidence. So if our brains just randomly appeared as they are, why should we think that anything that the thing we're thinking means anything?
Right. Now, what your naturalist would say to that is the scientific method. We use the scientific method to test whether what we believe is true, real, or right. But who came up with the scientific method? Our brains. So how can you use a method your brain came up with to test whether your brain comes up with things that are true? It's a circular argument. It's a self-defeating argument. It makes no sense. Because there's nothing outside the system, right? There's no God. There's no divine revelation. There's no ultimate measure of what is good, true, or right. There's nothing outside the system to determine if the system is true, real, or right. Therefore, we can't trust our minds to sort anything out. I can't trust that what I'm saying to you makes any sense. Maybe you think it doesn't. But Charles Darwin actually said this. It's pretty interesting. He said, "But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" So Darwin at least was beginning to understand the logical end of his belief system. That if what he said is true, is there any way to really know whether it's true? Because our minds just evolved from the mind of a monkey. If Darwin's naturalistic worldview is true, there are no means by which to establish its credibility. No means to even begin to prove it. Confidence in logic fails his own theory of evolution, which really then makes his theory of evolution a matter of faith, not of scientific truth. James Sire explains, one must hold that a brain, a device that came to be through natural selection and chance-sponsored mutations, can actually know a proposition to be true. And that's the problem with naturalism. Because that's something only theism provides. Only a belief in God provides this rational, intelligent spirit who's outside the system, from whom our rational thinking derives. We think rational thoughts because God thinks rational thoughts, and he is the only one who can judge whether our thoughts are rational or not. So if there is no God, how can we even know the laws of logic are true or not? Right? There are these laws of logic that we use to establish arguments, right? And things can't be self-contradicting, right? You can't just have circular reasoning. You've got to have you have a premise and then you support and prove that premise and those sorts of things. How do we know that's true? How do we know that's not just a figment of our imagination? This is what you call epistemological realism. The idea that we can't know anything. You can't know that you know. And that's an impossible position to hold because it denies you can hold the position. Epistemological nihilism says that you cannot know anything. Well, how do I know I cannot know anything? It doesn't make any sense. That's an ironic paradox. Naturalism is based on the human ability to know and reason. The very basis of science is that we can know and reason. But nihilism leads to the elimination of that. And I want to read to you from the book right here. He's got a few things in there on this chapter that just are brilliant. When he says, the whole point of this argument can be summarized briefly. Naturalism places us as human beings in a box. For us to have any confidence that our knowledge that we are in a box is true, we need to stand outside the box, or to have some other being outside the box provide us with information. Theologians call this revelation. But there is nothing or no one outside the box to give us revelation, and we cannot ourselves transcend the box. Ergo, epistemological nihilism. So, if we're in a box, how do we know we're in a box? Unless there's somebody outside the box that tells us we're in a box. Else we would just think this is the universe. Right? But that's who God is. God is the person outside the box giving us the revelation. They deny that. Nihilism questions the very fact that the box exists. How do we know there's a box? How do we know there's a universe? How do we know that I'm real? Now, obviously, that's an unstable position. How can anybody go through life believing that they don't exist? It's absurdity. It is a philosophical absurdity. It makes no sense. And then the final bridge is just the bridge of is and ought. We talked about this earlier, this idea of is and ought. Alan Bloom said, reason cannot establish values, and its belief that it can is the stupidest and most pernicious illusion. Reason cannot establish values. That's a great quote. Because naturalism, which is supposed to be based on human reason, naturalism assumes what is. It just tells us what is there. Here is the universe. It provides no rationale for what ought to be. But is that not the essence of ethics? Morality is about what ought to be, not what is. Not what I am doing, but what I should be doing, what I should not be doing, how people should, how they ought to act. No matter whether they're acting that way or not. Oughtness is the basis for morality. You probably have heard the term cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is one of the results of this way of thinking. And they basically say that whatever a tribe, a nation, a social group, whatever they are doing in the moment, whatever they say is valuable, is valuable. Cultural relativism is about what is. They would say that all cultures are equally true and valid. Every culture, that nobody has the right, Western society has no right to tell the Taliban in Afghanistan that their culture is wrong or bad or evil. And if they're out there stoning women to death because they dare take off their burqa, that is their culture. And you even hear the Taliban saying this. They said this recently. Don't interfere in our culture. You keep your Western culture out of here. What we are doing is our culture. That's cultural relativism. Now, the problem is that this doesn't reveal any oughtness. Cultural relativism only tells you what is for that culture. And the cultural relativists, think about this, the cultural relativists, they're relativists, right? They don't believe in absolutes. But that is an absolute. To say that basically what they said is the ultimate value is that we preserve a culture as it is right now. That is an absolute statement. They have themselves determined an ought. They said you ought to leave cultures as they are and preserve and celebrate them as they are. But once you say that, you're no longer a cultural relativist because you've made an absolute moral statement. And what they believe is they believe that preserving this culture as it is more valuable than helping it to better itself or advance or be transformed in any way. That their value is that cultures should be preserved and celebrated above all else. That's an ethic. It's a bad ethic, but that is their ethic. Here's an example. If one culture goes to war with another culture over religious views, right? You can make the argument that's part of their culture. The culture of Muslims is to blow up non-Muslims and kill them in a religious jihad. Then ought they to do that? Is that a good thing? Is that something we should celebrate? Naturalism has no answer to that. There is nothing in naturalism to say that these Muslim suicide bombers shouldn't go into crowded bus stations and blow themselves up with their firearm. There's nothing in naturalism to say that. There's no standard that says that is wrong. Sire gives this thought experiment on page 99. We're going to wrap up here in just a few minutes. He says, going back to that box summary, naturalism places us as human beings in an ethically relative box. For us to know what values within that box are true values, we need a measure imposed on us from outside the box. We need a moral plumb line by which we can evaluate the conflicting moral values we observe in ourselves and others. But there's nothing outside the box to a naturalist. There is no plumb line, there's no ultimate non-changing standard of value. Therefore, you have ethical nihilism. So we look at epistemological nihilism, i.e., you can't know anything. This leads to ethical nihilism. But there are no standards. There are no values. There is no ethic. There is no morality. You do what's right in your own eyes. That's where naturalism leads. Here's an example. This is a story that in Ingmar Bergman's film Wild Strawberries, in that there's a dream sequence where an old professor is arraigned before the bar of justice. When he asks the charge, the judge replies, "You're guilty of guilt." Is that serious? The professor asks. Very serious, says the judge. But that is all that is said on the subject of guilt. In a universe where God is dead, people are not guilty of violating the moral law. They're only guilty of guilt. And that is very serious. For nothing can be done about it. If one had sinned, there might be atonement. This is important. Listen to this. If one had sinned, meaning that there is a God, and you violate his commandments, there might be atonement. Because for there to be atonement, there has to be a person that you have sinned against, right? Atonement and sin are relational terms. If one had broken a law, the lawmaker might forgive the criminal. But if one is only guilty of guilt, there is no way to solve the very personal problem. And Sire says that states the case for a nihilist, for no one can avoid acting as if moral values exist and as if there is some bar of justice that measures guilt by objective standards. But there is no bar of justice, and we are left not in sin, but in guilt. Very serious indeed. This is the line of thinking behind critical race theory. But you hear me talk about white guilt. You're just guilty. You're guilty of guilt. And when you talk to these people that believe this, there is no solution. They will not give you a solution. There is no atonement. There is no rectifying it. You just are guilty. That's nihilism. That is a growing philosophy in our society today. There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, I heard somebody say if you question it, that means you're guilty.
That's right. Yeah, question that you're guilty, that just proves you're guilty. So all of this results in the loss of meaning. It all leads to total despair. Because if all of our values are only made valuable because we value them, then they have no value. They have no value. If we just measure truth against our own standard of truth, it's not true. That's nihilism. So, very quickly, 5 reasons nihilism is unsustainable. I think it's probably pretty obvious. From meaningless, nothing at all follows, or anything follows. A nihilist would say that there's really no difference between me taking a nap this afternoon and going and killing my neighbor. There's no difference. But there is a difference. There are different things that follow those actions, right? I mean, we see the impact of our choices every day. So this idea that what I do is meaningless, that's not true. We set goals. We take steps toward those goals. We see the results. So it doesn't comport with reality, with what we see in our life. Second, when nihilists think and trust their thinking, they're denying the very belief that thinking and knowing are not real. If I'm thinking the thought that I can't think a thought, I just think a thought. So it's not true, right? I mean, again, it's this inconsistency, it's a self-contradiction. The only affirmation of the nihilist is that there is no meaning. But that itself then would be meaningless. You can't say there's no meaning if there's not meaning, right? It doesn't make any sense. You would actually be proving your statement false. 3, while a limited sort of practical nihilism is possible for a while, eventually you reach a limit. So even if you could sort of be a little nihilistic, to be a practicing nihilist, you have to just deny everything you see. You have to deny everything about your existence. Every sense, thought, smell, taste, touch, you have to live in denial of it. It doesn't make any sense. Nihilism leads to the death of art. Now, we saw some nihilistic art. If you think about this, once you create art to profess the nihilistic worldview, that art really is no longer nihilistic because you've created something and you've given that something meaning. So, what's the meaning of your artwork? That there is no meaning. That's illogical. If the art is meaningless, it's not art, and that means it has no message. The whole idea of art is that you're conveying something. And number 5, nihilism poses severe psychological harm. Who can live their life daily believing that their life has no meaning? The people around you don't matter and aren't real. That's the ultimate depression. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche committed suicide in an insane asylum. Ernest Hemingway, who was a nihilist, committed suicide. Some of the artists we've looked at, like Beckett and Adams and Kafka, their work just descends further and further into this dark absurdity. Because that's all there is for a person with a nihilistic worldview. But I hope you've seen, especially in popular culture, there's a lot of shades of this out there. So it as a system of worldview may not exist. There may not be anybody out there that you could say they live their whole life as a nihilist, because you can't. But we see these thoughts and ideas everywhere. Just this past week on the news, I've seen several things about the Met Gala. I don't know if you've seen that. They have this big gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and it's like the Cinderella's ball. I mean, it is the big shindig, right? That all these highfalutin elites in society go to. Look it up online. Look at the costumes, and I say they are costumes. They're not just dresses or tuxes. They're costumes that these people wear. They're absurd. That's nihilism all over the place. They're actually trying to say that it's basically a farce. They're trying to say none of this matters. It's meaningless. They basically become satires of themselves. That's nihilism. And they revel in it. They think that it's clever and that it's funny. But it's really sad. All right, so there you go. We did it. Nihilism. Any thoughts or questions?
Got some Tylenol planned out.
I know. So somebody says, "What they talk about?" And I say, "It was pointless. It didn't mean anything." All right.
Somewhere I heard it was something you said it reminded me of when you take tests and people say there's no wrong answers.
That means there's no right answers. There are no wrong answers. There are no right answers. Now, here's a book that I used there at the beginning to look at the different art and the playwrights and stuff. This is another great book I recommend by Nancy Pearcey. It's called Saving Leonardo, A Call to Resist the Secular Assault on Mind, Morals, and Meaning. And she goes through and she does a lot of looking at popular culture, art, movies, literature, and really kind of assessing the worldview of these things and holding up against a biblical worldview and how we as Christians can't let these worldviews get into our mind through the culture around us. It's a really, really good book. And it's got lots of pictures, if you like pictures and stuff like that. I recommend it. Saving Leonardo. All right, let's look at